Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining today's session, webinar, fireside chat, whatever we want to call it, in discussing best practices for MedTech distribution agreements with our expert, Hakeem Adabi, who I will be introducing momentarily. Just as a reminder for everybody, as you're joining, the session's being recorded, and once the recording is posted, there'll be a follow-up email go out with a link to that for all the attendees, as well as some additional information that I'll be describing here in a second. So I'm actually Brad Robbins, one of the co-CEOs of MyCaribou. I'm actually filling in today for my business partner, Craig McInnes, who worked along with Hakeem to prepare for today. Although I am certainly excited to be part of the session. Craig is one of the many people down in Florida who is dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Milton. So certainly wish him and everybody in the area safety and quick recovery from what's been the second big storm in, I guess, 2 weeks now. So in terms of MyCaribou, just for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a global platform for the MedTech community that really provides three main functions or components: a marketplace with over 44,000 scrubbed companies, mostly manufacturers and distributors, as well as some others from over 150 markets around the world. That marketplace can help you kind of find and build new partnerships. A suite of tools to help you manage, communicate, and collaborate with those partners, be they new or existing partners, as well as an embedded finance offering that provides really aggressive spot foreign exchange rates, as well as the ability to hedge or essentially forward contract currency conversions up to a year to allow you to help to manage volatility in those global currency markets, which I know might be touched on a little bit in some of our conversation today as well. And in fact, Lindsay will do a short demo of the platform at the end of the session after we wrap up our chat with Hakeem. And we'll also encourage or share a link for you to be able to sign up for MyCaribou and get a 10-day free trial. Speaking of our registrations, we were just talking about it before, had a really good response to this webinar. Obviously, the topic resonated with our audience globally. Great to see in terms of breakdown of type of company, manufacturers and distributors, certainly a good mix there represented, about 2/3 manufacturers, a little less than a third distributors. Maybe not a surprise on the manufacturer side, but also great to see the turnout from distributors as well. Highlights obviously that this is a two-way relationship that's getting represented in these contracts that we're going to discuss. And obviously distribution globally as well, so people from around the world. So looking forward to maybe some of the questions from this diverse group. Again, just a reminder to post any questions that you think of in the Q&A panel. And last but not least, I guess, or maybe the most important introduction, is introducing our friend and our expert today, Hakeem Adabi. For almost 30 years, Hakeem's led global export or had global export leadership roles, Bernicare, Hegenberger included, where he used his commercial experience to lead growth in infection prevention, clinical waste management, surgical and postnatal solutions as well. And his, I think, success and approach boils down to a no-nonsense approach to business, specifically building strong distributor exporter relationships. He's the creator of the Healthcare Export Accelerator, author of the Sales Acceleration Formula, and host of the Hands-On Business podcast as well, and certainly brings lots of experience to the table on the topic we're discussing today, but also a lot of others surrounding these manufacturer-distributor relationships. Certainly haven't been involved in leading growth that led to 2 acquisitions as well. He's going to include some of that experience and his no-nonsense approach to building those relationships. Hakeem, thanks for joining us again today. Great to see you. And before we kind of kick off, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to share, correct, or add to that introduction.
No, my absolute pleasure. It's always a bit embarrassing when someone's talking about you, but yeah, hopefully I'll be shed some light on some of the topics that were mentioned and some of the questions. It's really quite nice to see how many people are attending based on the topic. because it could be a dry topic. I don't think it is, but it is one of those. It's critical for the success of any business when you try to move forward. That relationship between you and your partner, and I use the term partner advisedly, because that's when you get success, when you see them as a partner and a representative of your organization in that particular location.
Awesome, great. Hakeem, we're going to get maybe set the stage initially with maybe an obvious, or I don't know, easy one may not be the right answer, but an obvious one. So do we really need distribution contracts in place? What about sort of the handshake, trust, recommendations, or referrals?
Okay, thanks for that. Yes, so I mean, obviously there's about 25 to 30% of people who don't really have clear distribution agreements in place according to that poll. So I'm assuming that they're thinking that trust and recommendations are probably okay. So whenever anyone asks me that question, because it's not the first time I've been asked a question, I tend to say, well, before we actually say whether yes or no, look at it, your agreement with your partner, almost as if it's an employment contract. Now, obviously, they aren't your employees if you're a manufacturer, and if you're a distributor, you're not the employee of the manufacturer, but the distributor is the representative of your company in that specific territory. So possibly maybe a franchise agreement, maybe a better analogy, but I use employment contracts because everybody understands that very clearly. Because in essence, what it should be, it should be a document which demonstrates you've got close collaboration, but under legally binding, agreed upon terms. Because the goal obviously is to grow the brand and the sales of that product and ensure success for both parties, because if one is successful, the other is successful, and vice versa. And you obviously want to know what you're going to what the distributor is going to expect from the manufacturer, and what the manufacturer is expected to do, and what you're going to expect from each other. So if it was an employment agreement or a franchise agreement, you'd definitely have something legal in place. So whilst trust, long-standing relationships and recommendations are valuable and, dare I say, preferable in the first instance, a formal distribution agreement is essential for medtech companies, because when you're talking about a medtech company specifically, you've got the complexities of regulatory compliance, liability concerns, expectations in terms of performance, expectation in terms of what the manufacturer is going to do, what the cost centers, where they're going to be placed from a marketing point of view. They all require clear legal frameworks that define responsibilities, and the whole, defining responsibilities in terms of performance, defining responsibilities in terms of pricing, risk management, and trust alone, unfortunately, or fortunately, cannot protect businesses from disputes, from regulatory penalties if someone does something that they shouldn't do, or even just unforeseen market changes. So that's the long answer. The short answer is a formal agreement helps prevent misunderstandings and ensures that both parties are legally and commercially aligned, and that will hopefully then lead to positive relationships, and hopefully then things don't go wrong, because it's very clear what you try to do. But if things do go wrong in that circumstance, it's a clear plan, which is contractual, of what then happens next.
Terrific. Put you on the spot, but in your time in the industry, would you say that has changed over time? So we saw in the quick poll kind of 75-25 roughly, or 25-30 in terms of agreements in place or not. Would your sense in your time in the industry be more and more relationships are governed by these contracts, or would you think that has not changed at all over time?
No, I think it's definitely changed. I think 100%. If you go back even 10 years, I think there was lots of informal agreements which were just like a one-page document that someone had written down and someone had signed it, which isn't particularly legally binding because it's got no terms and conditions in it. And certainly, I would say over the last 5 or 6 years, I can't think of any businesses I've worked with who, if they haven't got agreements in place, are not looking to put agreements in place. So I'd say, yeah, it's definitely become much more of a concern for businesses that they want a legally binding agreement.
Gotcha, great. So when we talk about that, kind of maybe thinking a little bit from both sides of the table's perspective, so manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, what are some of the key provisions in those contracts to kind of help, as you said, put that framework in place for a strong partnership?
Yeah, I think then the key things really, I mean, starting just like at the most general level, it's about clarity of expectations. It's about being very clear on what is expected from both sides, what are the roles and responsibilities, i.e. who does what, when, and who pays for what. Because that's often a lot of the challenge, especially when you talk about commercial agreements. You know, the distributor thinks that, oh, well, yeah, their manufacturer's going to pay for all the marketing materials, whereas the manufacturer's thinking, no, that's going to be the distributor. And the same with exhibitions and things like that. That then starts causing problems because one of those two hasn't budgeted for that expense. And then all of a sudden, you're asking that party who didn't think they were going to do it to do it. So that's one of the key things, roles and responsibilities. Then, obviously, we always hope that every relationship is seamless, but I think we all know that any relationship you have, there are some times when it goes wrong. So the other thing I say is you need to have a clear process if something goes wrong, so that you want to have a very clear performance management in place from a manufacturer's point of view, but then you want to, from a distributor's point of view, you want to make sure that you know exactly what the responsibility of the manufacturer is, etc. So you want to have all those clear processes in place. So, for example, if you do have to go through performance management or you have to terminate the contract, you want to know very clearly what's the process for that. So it's not, you're not starting to argue at that point. It's just very clearly contractually laid out. This is what happens. This is your responsibility as a distributor. This is your responsibility as the manufacturer. And then you can refer to the contract. And then some of the other things, so that's almost like the generalities in terms of the overview of the things you need, clear responsibilities and roles, and then what happens if something goes wrong. Then all the basic things like ordering and delivery, you know, what the Incoterms, etc. Make sure that anything you can think of, you get it in the contract, because you'll be amazed the tiny little things that can cause lots of rifts between a distributor and a manufacturer. So you want to know what the Incoterms are, you want to know when they're going to deliver it, how it's going to be stored, and all those sort of things. You want to know about pricing and payment terms. You know, we want to understand how pricing is structured. You know, is it going to be adjusted? How is it going to be adjusted? How is payment going to be done? When is it going to be done? You know, is it every you know, payment on delivery? Is it payment after, you know, on terms, a month, 2 months, etc. And then trying to think of the things that may happen that aren't standard. So we talked about this before, about, you know, market dynamics and currency fluctuations. I think that's one of the questions I think I'll answer later, was about those currency fluctuations. How do you manage that in a contract? Because you don't want to just put in, right, this is the price, the currency fluctuates wildly, or the markets change wildly, and then all of a sudden one or both are out of pocket and there's no contractual provision to manage that. So that'd be another thing that I think is very important. Exclusivity clauses are very important, if applicable, and mostly they are. And that then allows you to clearly define territories, timelines for performance, and performance benchmarks, if you're going to have exclusivity, and we can talk a bit more about that. I think that's another question one of the audience asked. And then obviously regulatory compliance. Both parties must ensure, obviously, that they meet the regulatory standards, depending on which market they're in, whether that's the FDA, yeah, you're in the EU, you've got MDR, etc. You need to make sure that you understand what the regulatory liabilities are and the compliance that you require in those markets, and make sure that both of you, both distributor and manufacturer, are compliant. And then obviously you have the things, the liabilities, the IP, etc. So there's a whole raft, but I think that generally gives you the key provisions I think that you need to have in there. And obviously, not obviously, I'm saying obviously, but we have a distribution agreement, a template that we've had legally ratified, which people can use it, but whatever people do when they have a template, I always say you still want to get it legally checked. Even though the template we have and we go through it on our online program, it's legally checked. Things change, markets are different, products are different. So it gives you a really good, robust template with all the things you should have in it, but always check it with your local legal as well. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just hit on one of the things I was going to kind of just mention or ask about, was really related to, you know, different types of products. So if I'm selling, you know, if it's a purely large capital equipment versus capital plus disposables versus purely consumables, I would assume that there would be some some perhaps specific considerations, which I think you kind of mentioned. Now, it's got a good segue maybe into the next question. You know, a lot of terms that we talked about there, and depending on which way you're looking through the lens, you may think a little bit differently about some of those terms. So I guess really,
Yes.
I'm the optimist, like to think the answer to this question is yes, but is it possible, I guess, or how do you go about setting these up or positioning this as kind of a win-win as opposed to it being, you know, purely let's sit down and debate, you know, all these terms. So I guess, you know, just your thoughts on trying to, is it possible to, and how do you go about thinking of contracts as a win-win?
Yeah, I think that I'll flip it slightly, because my question always is, if it's not a win-win, why would you enter into it? Because I think if it's not a win-win, sooner or later there'll be an issue. Because if the manufacturer thinks, oh, this is great, but the distributor doesn't, the distributor at some point will get disgruntled. They'll stop promoting it. They'll just stick it in the bag with a raft of other products. And then sooner or later, the distributor will, the manufacturer will think, oh, this isn't really working. And there'll be problems. And vice versa. If the distributor thinks it's great, because they're getting a great margin, for example, and the distributor and the manufacturer thinking, well, I'm not really making that much money out of it, that's going to cause problems further down the line. So I suppose the question really for me is, which was the second part of the question, how do you ensure a win-win? I think there's kind of about 5 things that I always think about when I'm starting with a contract. So the first one is, do I, as a manufacturer, if I'm talking from the manufacturer's point of view, have a clear vision for my business and my export business? Because if I do, then you're starting from a point that you're actually going to work and select partners that actually align with that vision. So when you're working with 2 companies that have a similar kind of outlook on the medical device market and what they're trying to achieve in those markets, that automatically means you start from a standpoint where you're likely to have a better cooperation to deliver on the same goals, which are going to take you towards that vision. And that then means that as you start going through the clauses in the agreement and you're talking about the agreement, they should really be based on delivering what that vision is. And that should be kind of like a joint vision, because you've selected down that line. Now, that obviously does not mean that there won't be points of contention. So therefore, number 2, you need to be able to, again, in the spirit of cooperation, you need to be able to see the other person's point of view and be prepared to compromise where you can and where it's reasonable to do so, and it doesn't jeopardize that vision. But again, I focus really a lot on vision, because I think that helps actually iron out a lot of the problems. Because a lot of the times that I've seen contracts or partnerships not working well is I, as the manufacturer, have one view on what I want to be happening in the market, and the distributor has a completely different view, and you're not aligned. So therefore, they're off doing something that's not in the same line as I want. So that's the first thing. It's making sure you've got an aligned vision and that you're seeing it and looking from both sides rather than just looking at your own side and being blinkered. Number 3, I think that where you cannot compromise, or you think that this is a red line and actually this is so critical to the business, then you have to explain the rationale for those clauses and why you can't compromise. Because I've found that 99 times out of 100, once you've actually got that relationship, you've got a similar vision, you've been collaborative all the way through, when you get to a point where you just say, look, I can't compromise on that. This is why I can't compromise. And this is from both sides. This is why we can't compromise. This is why it's in there. This is how it drives the business forward. 99 times out of 100, people accept it. And then number 4, you know, I think this is just a general thing in terms of negotiation and contracts. You want to ensure that both parties are walking away feeling that the agreement, I'm not saying is, yeah, I'm delighted with absolutely everything in agreement, but at the very least, both sides should be thinking, well, this is a fair agreement, it's a balanced agreement, and that both parties have different but equally important responsibilities to make that product, service, device a success in that region, and again, deliver on that vision. And there's lots of things you can put in there around shared investments and educational campaigns and marketing materials, you know, tiered pricing and discounting based on volumes, you know, KPIs, not just sales quotas, so that actually it's not just, well, you hit this target or you're not a very good distributor, but there's lots of KPIs which allow you to do it. And I think when you start putting all those things in, both sides can see, actually, this is not just about a transactional relationship. This is really a partnership. And when you have a genuine partnership, you tend to have a much better relationship, and people are much more open to accepting some terms that they may not have been if it was just an antagonistic relationship. And then fifth and finally, I always say try and do some of these negotiations in person. Because I think now, especially since COVID, lots of people are doing everything online. You know, these are deep relationships that you're hoping to develop. And I think, yeah, you can do a lot of it online, but I would say that you want at least 2 meetings if you can, because these contracts, if they're worth what you think they are, probably take sometimes months to negotiate, sometimes a lot shorter. But I would always say if you can go over to see your distributor, you know, cost willing, and they can come over to see you if you're a manufacturer, and then you can meet in person. It shows the commitment of both sides. And I think that what I find is that virtually every contract I've done face to face, always over the long run, is much smoother and much deeper than when I've just done something online and I've met the people online and we've gone through that process. So it's quite a long answer, but I think it warrants that length of an answer.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It was sort of a broad question, I think, generally, but I think I think it did sort of drive some of that kind of volume, because it is so important, as you said. If both sides aren't walking away feeling like this is fairly representative of me, and all those steps that you talk, communication, kind of compromise, empathy, et cetera, to get to that point, it can be a costly mistake, I'm sure. So yeah. You touched on a topic that I think can be prickly at times, is really exclusivity. So if we think about kind of navigating exclusivity clauses, how you kind of think about incorporating them, maybe when they're appropriate or not, or just your thoughts on kind of navigating what can be seems in some ways obvious, but can be a bit of a contentious topic at times to include in these contracts.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to that due diligence that you do with your partners, because hopefully if you're in the right frame of mind, then it kind of becomes quite relatively easy in my experience in terms of navigating that. Because really what I've seen is distributors always want exclusivity, understandably, because they then feel that they can invest properly without worrying about losing the business. Because what they don't want to do is invest loads of time and then somebody else, another distributor, comes in and then steals their lunch, basically. And the main reason I've identified that manufacturers don't want exclusivity, if they don't want exclusivity, is because they're concerned about underperformance. Is that distributor going to do a good job? That's why I said doing your due diligence on a distributor, and both vice versa, is important, because if you've done that, then you have a lot higher confidence, and you've been through the process I've discussed in terms of the contract, you have a lot higher confidence that actually they're going to do a job. But it doesn't matter how much you do there, you can still have that feeling, well, actually, am I sure I want to give them exclusivity? So to mitigate that, then, as I said, make sure you have the right distributor to start off with. But then number two, I think that what I've always done is try and put trial periods in, so that you'll say, okay, if I'm not that confident for whatever reason, then I'll give you exclusivity, for example, and you negotiate all of this in the contractual period. So it's not that you're just saying this at the end, but then, okay, I'm going to give you exclusivity for, say, 6 months. And then contractually in the clause, it said if you deliver, then you continue your exclusivity. If you don't deliver, then we can remove exclusivity. It doesn't mean that you do it, but again, within that, I would be saying that you've got KPIs rather than just, you've got 6 months to hit this sales target. Sales targets might be part of it, but it should be some KPIs which make sense to both parties. And I think that's then fair to both sides, because you're given a commitment contractually that, we've agreed on these terms. If you hit those terms, then exclusivity is guaranteed. And then the third point would be starting out without exclusivity, and then giving incentive for them to gain exclusivity. So, for example, similar to what I said in the previous point, given 6 months, depending on the sales cycle, because it has to be fair, how long you're going to give them to achieve certain things. Give them a certain geographic location for 6 months, and then say, well, if you deliver on the agreed targets, on the agreed KPIs, then we will then move that to an exclusive contract. Again, it's fair. And these are examples of what I've done to navigate that exclusivity, because that's always a question that comes up. And I find that, yeah, as I said, in the majority of cases, the distributor will want exclusivity for obvious reasons. And it's normally the manufacturer who's pushing back on, I'm not sure whether I want to give you this exclusivity. I want to hedge my bets and have 3 or 4. I've always found when I'm working on behalf of the manufacturer to have a motivated, exclusive relationship with somebody have always yielded better results for me and with the companies I've worked with than having, say, 2 or 3 different distributors in the same location. Now, the US is probably slightly different because the US is massive, and finding one exclusive person who can do the whole of the US is quite rare, to be honest. So that's a slightly different thing. But outside of the US, generally, I would say that exclusivity. But even in the US case, then often the states are like countries. So I'd give exclusivity for a state or a series of states, and then what I've just said is completely exactly the same as with any other country.
Great. Okay. Yeah, and I think you kind of mentioned 2 approaches there. One was about sort of providing exclusivity with some sort of KPIs that at least give the supplier some options to reconsider if it's not going well, or the other end being the opportunity for a distributor to kind of earn exclusivity after a period of time. One of the things you said at the end is it fair to kind of infer that you would typically lean towards the former, meaning starting with exclusivity so that you're kind of aligning your interests and motivations together? Would that be sort of your default or your go-to, or is it entirely unique in every situation?
I mean, it's unique in every situation, but if I'm honest, virtually every contract that I've worked with, there's been a couple of exceptions, but most, again, I'd say 99% have always been exclusive because the process to get a distributor is and get that partnership is so intense, in my opinion, because it requires due diligence, it requires several meetings before you get to the one you want. I think you want to give that confidence to the distributor, your partner, that actually you're serious about this and you want to work together. So I want to start off with, actually, I'm only going to work with you because if I'm working with 2 or 3, I just don't think it gives the right message to your partner.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. I think before we get into the next one, I think Lindsay was going to pop up just another quick poll question here. So if you could take a quick second to read this and respond. This is answer all of the ones that apply. So which of the following contract challenges do you have? So I guess for the audience member, maybe that it's you're facing now, or that you have experienced frequently or commonly in your experience. So we'll give a few seconds just to answer this. Appreciate it. All right, so it looks like kind of across the board, people have experienced lots. I'm in some ways happy to see that dispute resolution and contract termination is maybe the least selected. So maybe people are kind of looking ahead to get out in front of that one. But cool. Okay. Terrific. I don't know if there's anything that you saw there that jumped out to you, Hakeem.
No, actually, it's interesting, the regulatory one, because I can't remember the exact stats, but I think they said there was a report that basically said 75% of all medical device companies have challenges in going into new markets, and the 2 reasons were basically targeting the wrong market, so missteps getting into the market, and the second one was regulatory and compliance. So that doesn't surprise me. Sure. in the slightest.
Okay, so you touched a little bit on this earlier. I want to talk just a little bit about pricing strategies. So how do we think about, effective pricing strategies that, again, can benefit both parties? And you've certainly, I think, underscored it's got to be, both parties benefiting, but obviously both want to be competitive, both want margin, both may need some flexibility. So just, maybe share a little bit around how we can structure these pricing strategies that allow us to be competitive and flexible in markets.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's about 3 or 4, probably about 4 key things that I look at when I'm looking at pricing strategies. And as you said there, Brad, the first thing is you want to understand whether the pricing you're thinking about, and I'm talking about the end user pricing here, is a sensible one, because everything kind of works back from that. So you need to understand what is the competitive pricing in the market for competitor products. And, a lot of these medical devices are innovations, so there might not be a competitive product. So you then need to look at a similar product and a market sort of like pricing generally. And there's lots of ways you can look at that. But it's probably a bit too complicated to go into now. But so you need to understand, right, what's the end user pricing that you're trying to get to that will make you competitive in that market? Because so that's the starting point for me. That's number one. Number two is then it's about that partnership again, having open and honest communication. So as a manufacturer, you obviously need to know what margin you need to make, but you also need to understand what margin the distributor needs to make, and vice versa. So you can't go into it that saying, well, I want to make 90% margin and I'm not really bothered what they make. And same thing from the distributor point of view. I want to make 90% margin, but I'm not really bothered what the manufacturer wants to make, because that way you're going to have a problem, because you're going to be trying to get X, they're going to be trying to get Y, and those two things might not meet. So I've always, and I'm not saying it's always an easy conversation, because people are very protective of their financial information, but that's why I open saying it has to be a partnership if you want to be successful. Because once you can start having conversations, and you might not give them exactly the margin, but you're honest about, right, well, this is what we need to make as a business, and therefore everything we're discussing has to allow for some flexibility around that. And then the same thing with the distributor, because once you can do that, then that allows you to agree on a transfer price to the distributor, and it also allows you to agree on, okay, so what are we going to sell in the market for? So agreeing on that end user pricing also helps together, rather than just leaving it to the distributor. Then number three is about, okay, so you've now agreed on a pricing that you're both happy with, and again, this is obviously negotiation. Then there might still be flexibility in there, because you're going to have competition, you're going to have challenges. So I always put some kind of tiered pricing into that contract that's maybe based on volume, because that's obviously a good compromise, because you're then saying, right, okay, so this is the price that we need to have to start off with, but as we develop together, then as your business grows and you're obviously doing better, then we can obviously, because that then means we as a manufacturer are doing better, then we can actually look at volume breaks, tiered pricing, etc., which then allows you, if you're going for a large volume tender, for example, or you're going in and you're going to have to really do something with your price, then you need to have that conversation up front. And then the other thing that we obviously often put in is we protect pricing around tenders. So you'd have almost like a slightly different process or different pricing structure in for specific tenders. And what I tend to try to do is at the outset say, okay, so what are the tenders that you have, so that we actually, we're not just having tenders popping up that we never thought about, and then we're always having to drop the price, but we've actually got, like, we're going to target these 3 or 4 tenders in the first year, these 3 or 4 tenders in the second year, and there we're going to have this sort of pricing methodology. And some people may think, oh yeah, but how do I know that? How do I know what the tenders are? And my argument always is, if you've got the right partnership, one of the key things you're going to be asking your partner who's in the market is, do you know the key players? Do you know the tenders? Do you know where the business is coming from? Because if you're not doing that and you haven't got a solid business plan from both sides, actually, then you're going to have an issue. So number one is knowing about the pricing in the market. Number two is about knowing what margin that you want. Number three is about pricing planned in terms of tiered pricing, etc. And then number four is dealing with different currencies. You need to think about how you're going to deal with currency fluctuations, and you need to have that in the contract, because if you get that wrong, then what starts out as a great contract may become very disadvantageous to one or both parties because of the massive fluctuation. So all of a sudden I'm not making anywhere near what I was making a month, 2, 3 months ago. So those are the 4 key points that I try to think about when I'm looking at pricing strategies, negotiating them, and maintaining competitive across the market. But again, I keep referring back to it. If you see it as a partnership, then it's a lot easier. If you see it as I'm just trying to make loads of money and they can sort themselves out, that's where you have a problem.
Right. Yeah, and I think you might have the mechanism may be the same as one of the ones you described. I'm sort of thinking, we're seeing a lot, and certainly we see it when we think about the suppliers or the manufacturers on the My Caribou platform. Oftentimes there are suppliers moving into markets, and it may be markets they've never been in. It may be brand new technology or new therapeutic kind of modalities where the best you might be able to come up with are kind of analogies in the market. So in other words, you don't really know ultimately what the price sensitivity of the market's going to be. You found some of those elements in a potential partner, you're collaborating, et cetera. How do you kind of maybe think about or accommodate the fact that we're kind of going on this journey a little bit together here, and maybe it's going to take us the first 6 months to really understand where that pricing is going to land? Is there any different mechanism you might put in place for that, or is it really covered by just some of those flexibility terms that you described earlier?
Yeah, no, I think so, and I think that it's I try and put everything into the contract because it just prevents issues later on. So in that situation, it would state that, right, I'd almost put in, and I've done it, like for the first 6 months, this is the pricing, and then we'll have a review of pricing based on the market. And that to me always seems to be the best way of doing it. That you have a little trial period because neither of you are 100% sure. Now, if you pick the partner like I tried to do it, then you'll have done some price testing before you've actually entered into that agreement. So hopefully that doesn't occur because you've already done some testing with some customers and they've said yes. But customers often say lots of things, and then when it's actually time to actually buy it, all of a sudden it's, oh no, that's much more expensive. Oh yeah, I've now spoken to a few more people. I don't think we can afford that. So I always say, okay, well, let's do it for 6 months, just in line with that exclusivity period or etc. And you say, right, so this is the pricing for that period, and we're going to test it, and then we're going to come back after 6 months. And we're not saying we're going to change it, but we're going to have a proper pricing review to say, do we need to change it to be competitive?
Great. Yeah, and I guess that goes back to what you've underscored all along, which is if you've got a collaborative relationship, you see it as a partnership, you can kind of take those steps together, knowing that you're trying to land at the right spot, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. Okay. So I guess when we think specifically about the rise in or increasing prevalence of digital health technologies, I guess maybe one of the questions would be how or if you feel contracts, may need to evolve or consider evolving, given sort of new risks, new compliance, sort of as it relates to, digital technologies, et cetera. So any thoughts, any things that you've been kind of seeing or considering recently as it relates to some of these new digital health technologies and contracts?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I'd say is don't assume, because I've seen this actually, and I've seen people getting problems with it, don't assume it's not a medical device because it's a digital product. It might not be, but it's very likely if it's a MedTech device in the health space and it's software or digital, it is probably covered under the auspices of being a medical device and MedTech. So you need to make sure that you're clear on that. So then once you establish it as a medical device, then all of the stuff I've said so far is the same in terms of regulatory and making sure that you understand the environment into which you're going. But then, you then have to obviously beef up the provisions for things like data privacy, cyber security, because you're now becoming almost like not quite, but you're like a Facebook, and you know all the challenges people like Facebook and X are having because they're not complying to rules and regulations in different jurisdictions. So I think with the growing use of not just that digital health, but connected devices, these are things that you need to really take into consideration. And then you need to address things, again, that lots of people don't think about: the software upgrade cycle. How often is that? Is it free? How do you then get that out? And you obviously know, because you've got digital tech, how do you get that out? Through a distributor, to make sure that everybody's always got the latest upgrade. And then obviously, as always, ensuring compliance with whatever those regulations may be, like GDPR or HIPAA in the US, around holding of data, and using people's data, especially in a health environment, which obviously HIPAA is specifically around health GDPs, is more general in Europe and across the world. And then obviously contracts obviously should therefore also clarify responsibilities for ongoing technical support as well. Because again, it's about clarity so that the distributor knows what support that they're going to get from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer knows what capabilities the distributor has to do a lot of that stuff. So I think, I don't think ostensibly there's a massive change in essence of that contract. It's just different things that you're going to be focusing on. You're going to be focusing a lot less on distribution, Incoterms, and all that sort of stuff, because you're not taking a product and taking it from that point A to point B. And then you have to start thinking more about the, as I said, the data privacy, cybersecurity, software upgrades, etc. I think that, and there's a plethora of things, but I think those are the key ones that you'd start thinking about immediately that you wouldn't probably think about if it was like a physical device.
Right. You hit on a couple of things that you talked about GDPR or HIPAA or, obviously others, but I think it just leads to maybe when we think of MedTech companies, and this would probably be more from the manufacturer side, but, what are some of the maybe practices you think about in terms of ensuring that your distribution agreement, so you may have this sort of master kind of template, but ensuring that it aligns with sort of global standards, because obviously whether it be regulatory regimes or standards within one market or another, or other just kind of legal enforcements or standards that differ across the world. So we're maybe just some thoughts or practices around ensuring, your distribution agreement is sort of valid, I guess, or meaningful across the globe.
Yeah, I think there's no real way to circumvent this. There's specialists in regulatory and legal, aren't they? So I always make it very clear to people, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a regulatory expert, but I've worked on lots of contracts. So I pick quite a lot up. But I still use regulatory and legal advice, whatever contract I'm doing. I'd never just say, right, well, I know what I'm doing, so I want to give this contract across. I always make sure it's ratified and checked, because especially when you're going into lots of markets, there's lots of different regulations, and often the market you go into, maybe one of the criteria for going to that market is actually you understand the regulations and you've got compliance in that market. So I think that you need to make sure that you understand them clearly, and I don't think there's any short way to get to that. Obviously, you can speak to people like me, and I can give you pointers and I can give you templates, but I'd still say you need to get it checked. And then once you've done that, then you need to put those protective clauses into the contract to make sure that both the manufacturer and the distributor are compliant to those, to make sure that actually you're covered. And then from a manufacturer's point of view, then what I always do is I would include audit clauses that allow regular reviews of those standards in the contract, because it's very easy for somebody to say, yeah, we comply to all those standards, and they may well do at the time you do the contract, but as those standards change and things need to be updated, are both parties still compliant? So I think that's what needs to be in there. And then it needs to be two-way, because there's sometimes things that the manufacturer needs to have in certain markets, i.e., the manufacturer has to have liability insurance of X amount, and therefore you need to then see some evidence, and it needs to be in the contract that, yes, the liability insurance for the manufacturer is always this, the liability insurance for the distributor is that, and both of us at any point can ask to see the latest insurance to make sure that actually you're still compliant. So I think that seems to me has always been the best way of working together. And again, if you've got a proper partnership, you don't tend to have issues with it, because everyone wants to be compliant, because everyone wants to make sure that they can get in without any problems, and they're selling in ad infinitum for years to come.
Right. Yeah. Interesting point in terms of sort of the point in time status of both organizations and kind of approvals or compliance versus what may happen 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the length of a distribution contract. So really good point there. So last ones before we get into a couple of the ones that were submitted by the attendees. So as we kind of sort of an overall shift towards value-based care. Maybe talked about more in different markets than others at present, but certainly I think generally we see the shift. How do manufacturers and distributors need to think about adapting contract terms, if at all, to kind of reflect those changes in models? So I obviously think about, as accountability for outcomes starts to get sort of pushed through the supply chain, how do all the various stakeholders, and in this particular case, manufacturers, distributors, bringing product to market and ultimately selling to end users, how should they be thinking about that as it relates to distribution agreements?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question, because what I've seen is manufacturers, and I've seen an example of this with Medtronic, for example, manufacturers doing outcome-based pricing to end users. I've not really seen much, and I've seen distributors will probably do it, but I've not seen it go all the way down the line. So I've not seen manufacturers doing it to distributors who are then doing it to the end user. But I think as it starts to become more prevalent, I think that's probably one of the things that manufacturers are going to have to start looking at, is how do you end-to-end the value proposition that's been given to the end user. And I think, again, if it's in a partnership agreement, then it's most likely that you'll be able to do it. But I think so yeah, in other words, some kind of risk-sharing agreement that you may well say, all right, as a manufacturer, I'm going to get my cost covered, but then I'm going to look at some of the outcome and value-based outcomes that you're being paid on in that particular contract. And then looking at obviously the metrics that obviously are beneficial for you as the manufacturer and the distributor and the end user, which you can say, okay, well, we can put some of those in the contract because we have to put it into the contract because that's what the end user is saying. It's then difficult for me as a distributor to pay you right up front when I'm not going to get paid up front. So I think it's about understanding what those outcomes are supposed to be, understanding how much that manufacturer can help the distributor to achieve those, and then looking at, I think, if I'm honest, it's unlikely that someone is going to do as a manufacturer, do a pure risk sharing agreement where actually, that end user is basically saying, give us the product. When we hit these patient outcomes or these outcomes, then we'll pay you X and give you some upside. Then I don't think a manufacturer will back to back that completely, but you can look at offsetting it with, again, all right, we're going to give you a lower price, but if you get an upside, then we can share in that upside because we're giving you a lower price. And again, the tiered pricing can sometimes help that out. But I think it's, again, very much dependent upon how aligned those two distributors are. Because if the distributor is all about if the manufacturer is just about, I need to get some cash in, then it's unlikely they're even going to entertain any value-based sort of contract. So if I was a distributor, I would probably raise it with the manufacturer, but not expect to get it immediately, and say, look, is this something that once we've got a practice or a practice use case, and we can show you and demonstrate you how this is beneficial for the market share of the business, the growth of the business, that this is something that we could revisit in terms of a profit sharing or rebate agreement as we move forward. I think that's probably where I think it should start to go.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that one of the thoughts that or I guess questions I was going to pose is, it seems like that in those cases where, whether it be the market or just that particular product or therapeutic area is being influenced by this more, that probably needs to start to become a talking point earlier in that, as you're starting to think about establishing that partnership, so that you're maybe not surprised later on when you have to have some of these conversations or be flexible together. So yeah, that's really interesting. So just a couple, I think we got enough time here for maybe a couple of the questions that were submitted from the audience. And again, for everybody who has a question that we don't get to, which probably will be several of them, we'll certainly, Hakeem has again agreed just to kind of provide some of the answers, and we will share those as well. So I guess I'll start out with a maybe I guess a more direct one is, what is, or is there an ideal duration for a distribution partnership agreement? Or what may drive some of those decisions, I guess.
Yeah, I would say there There isn't ideal. There isn't an ideal. It depends on the business, and for me, it depends on the sales cycle, because obviously, if it is a really long sales cycle, depending on what the product's, capital equipment could be a lot longer than a consumable, then I would probably have a longer contract in place, because you need a longer contract, because no distributor is going to, let's say, for example, the sales cycle is 12 months, which is possible, then, and you're giving them like a 12-month contract, then no one's going to work hard for 12 months when they've got an opportunity to be removed at the end of that 12 months. So standard, I think, of 3 to 5 years, depending on the confidence that you have in your distributor. I tend to do 3 years, actually, the general, but then I do a yearly review, so that everyone knows, and it's not, you're reviewing all the way through the year, but you have a yearly review that's written into the contract. And then if that's all going well, then in the second year, I tend to then extend that out to 5 years, because as a manufacturer, what you're trying to do is show that we have confidence in you, but because you're having review periods, you're protecting yourself, that if it's not working well, then there's things that you can do to mitigate that. And then from a distributor point of view, you obviously want the longest contract, because that gives you confidence to invest and invest money in to that relationship. So 3 to 5 years generally. The 5 years, I will tend to do, like, if I've got a seasoned distributor and I've worked with them, I've had 1 3-year contract with them, they've done really well, they're established, then I would probably then renew it with a 5-year contract. And actually, in certain cases, I think it's probably only ever happened twice that I've been working with, we've given really long-standing distributors 10-year contracts, but then you have like clauses in it in terms of, well, we're going to review it every year, we're then going to have a look at it at 3 years, we're going to have a look at it at 5 years, but you've actually boxed them off with exclusivity for 10 years. But yeah, if it's a new agreement with a new distributor, then I tend to go for 3 years and then have a probation period and a review after 1 year.
Perfect. Obviously, we saw the breakdown of our registrants. I think about a third were from Europe. So this one came from I guess somebody thinking about that market. But are there European-specific terms that should be considered when putting contracts in place? So a little bit specific, but just given your location as well, you may have some thoughts on at least a couple of highlights for consideration there.
Yeah, well, certainly the answer is yes. Yeah. But that's no different to any other market. So you're not going to go into any market where there isn't specific terms that you need to consider that may be slightly different than others. From a regulatory point of view, then you definitely, as I said, you need to speak to a reg person, a lawyer, to go in depth. But obviously having that GDPR, which is obviously a big one, competition and exclusivity law, because they've put in, I think it's called VBER regulation, which has changed, I think, in 2022, which is actually really looking, it's called vertical block exemption regulation. And the vertical is about having verticals. So it's talking about, a lot of it's about digital, and then about having lots of distributors, because what they're trying to do is mitigate pricing so that you've not got loads of different pricing in the market, and you're not trying to undercut pricing with your digital products, as opposed to what people are doing there. So there's protection for the distributors. I think now they only allow you to have a certain amount. I don't think you're allowed more than 5 distributors per market now. I don't know why you'd want more than 5 distributors in any market in Europe, but they've put like a barrier on that. And then in certain countries, when your termination clauses, they have some mandated notice periods, which actually override whatever you put in the contract. Belgium is one of those that I know I've worked with directly, and we had a particular term in the contract, but they have a different law that manages distributor relationships. So you need to make sure that you understand that when you go into the country, because yes, there's European law, but there are some specific country laws below that. And then obviously MDR, CE marking, environmental regs, you need to make sure you understand if you're in the UK, VAT collection and where's it paid, conflict resolution. I did see a little question there, and I know we're not going to get to it today, but I'll answer it after this. Is conflict resolution. What law, under what law is that contract? And therefore, if there is a conflict, where are you going to go to? Arbitration? Or are you going to go to? You have to go to an arbitration court, and if it is, under what law is that arbitration? So I think those are the quick things that pop into my mind when I'm thinking about European legislation. And now, obviously, in the UK, we're outside of that. So it's relevant because obviously we export into Europe, but it's not as relevant as it once was.
Gotcha. Awesome. Okay, and I think yeah, to your point, I think we're sort of at the end of our time today. There were obviously, I think there was several questions that were asked throughout the session, and there was a couple or a few more that were asked in advance. So we'll try and just kind of collate those and share that. Certainly want to thank everybody for attending today. We had a great turnout. Lots of people registered and lots turned out, which is great. I hope everybody found the session valuable, some ideas, some thoughts raised. I always find myself, if I spend a half hour on a session, if I take a nugget or two away, it was always worth my time. So I hope all of our attendees feel the same way. As I said, we'll send a follow-up email with kind of the link to the recorded session. Feel free to kind of share that with any colleagues as well. Hakeem, thanks as always for your time, your kind of willingness to contribute to the MedTech community. You've done it with us a lot. We follow you on LinkedIn because you share lots of nuggets on there as well. So really appreciate your time and thoughts. And again, you'll see on the screen here, Lindsay will, I think, share it probably in the chat as well. But Hakeem has provided an opportunity to book a free 30-minute session focused on just exploring kind of your export strategy. The link, as I mentioned, is here. To book that, Lindsay will share it as well. Certainly, if you're thinking of any of this, this is a valuable offer. So take Hakeem up on that. Again, really appreciate your time, thoughts. Always great to see you and work with you, and hope you enjoyed our session today as well, Hakeem.
No, I did. Thank you very much. And as I said, my commitment is, when I made the commitment, I didn't realize I have that many questions. But my commitment is, because there's a couple of other questions that we didn't answer, yeah. And my commitment is, don't worry about. I can't say I'll get them by the end of the week, but I'll definitely make sure that I've answered all these questions by Tuesday of next week. So you'll have an answer. And if you need it sooner, then jump on a strategy session or email me separately, and I'll definitely get to answering every single one of those questions. But thanks, Brad. It's always a pleasure. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.